Didn't realise I was that funny. You wait until you hear my jokes. Welcome to Nellie on the sofa. This is, I don't know how many we've done of these now, 7, something like that, 8, 6, 7. We're joined today. I'm Ben Slater. I'm the director and principal social worker at Nellie Supports. And today I'm joined by one of our social workers, Ashleigh Reeves. So Ashleigh, do you want to just explain a little bit about who you are? And
Yeah.
I've kind of done that a little bit. But.
Yeah. So I'm a social worker and mental capacity assessor here at Nellie. I've been here for over a year now.
Yeah.
And I've done lots of testamentary capacity assessments, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
Done a few. We do.
Done lots and lots.
We work this out. We do about between 160 and 180 assessments a month at the moment.
Really? Wow.
So yeah, over a year you'll have done a couple.
Just a couple.
Just a
yeah.
couple, yeah. With these sessions, I always like to explain something because it's kind of changed, and it's important and not important today, and that'll make sense in a second. So the Mental Capacity Act changed, and apologies to everyone that's heard this already, but for those that haven't, this year. So previously, the capacity assessment, the test under the Mental Capacity Act 2005 was: can the person understand has the person got an impairment of the mind or brain? And if so, is it impacting on their capacity through stage 2, which is can they understand, retain, use and weigh, and then communicate their decision. Earlier on in the year, it switched, and the law now says that the person needs to be able to understand the relevant information, retain that information long enough to be able to use and weigh that information, the consequences and risks, and then be able to communicate their decision. And if they can't do one of those things, is that because of an impairment of the mind or brain? So stage 1, stage 2, flip, stage 2, became stage 1, stage 1 became stage 2, yeah. Stage 3 became, oh God, it just gets more and more confusing. Now I've explained all of that, do you want to explain why it's not actually relevant?
Yeah. So we don't really follow that, do we, for testamentary capacity assessment? For testamentary, it's Banks v Goodfellow, which was like a landmark case which sort of set out the legal test that we use when doing testamentary capacity assessments.
And this dates back to 1870.
A very long time ago. It certainly stood the test of time, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was before I was born. I know, amazing, yeah. Only just, yeah. When's your probation review? Now, it was also tested, and I know we should do our research before we say things, but I didn't. I can't remember whether it was this year or last year, or it might have even been the year before. COVID kind of screws up your brain a little bit with time scales, doesn't it? But I'm sure it was Erwin Mitchell tested Banks versus Goodfellow at the courts to see whether it should still be the test that's followed, and the judges at the time said, actually, no, it's not the Mental Capacity Act. We're still going to put it onto Banks versus Goodfellow. So this is about one of the only decisions. Lots of decisions have case law that applies to it, but even that case law that applies to it still comes under the MCA 2005. Yes. Banks versus Goodfellow has got nothing to do with the Mental Capacity Act 2005, has it? Do you want to just explain what the test is under Banks versus Goodfellow?
So there's different limbs. There's 4 limbs to the test. The first one is that the person must understand the effects and consequences of making a will. The second is, I'm trying to think off the top of my head because it's not written down anywhere, that the person must be able to comprehend the extent of their estate.
Yeah.
They need to give thought to who might expect to benefit from their estate.
The comprehension of the claims.
Yeah.
The language is so archaically worded, but they have to understand who they're leaving the lot to, and understand their moral obligations.
Yes.
And if they're excluding somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one is, does the person suffer from a disorder of the mind or brain that perverts their sense of right or prevents them from disposing of the property by will?
Well done.
Very wordy
well
that
done.
one is,
yeah.
isn't it?
We
should have written it down.
Always throws me on that. Yeah. And it's quite an unusual. Well, it's an unusual one because I always think it ends up almost following the MCA test anyway.
Yeah.
But it's not. It doesn't. Just to clarify, when we're writing reports, the templates that we use follow that same template. So we have a separate template for our reports to the standard mental capacity reports because of that difference. So let's start at the beginning then. So the person needs to have capacity to understand a will and the extent of the will as well. So I'm going to ask you exactly what I ask all of the people that I assess for testamentary capacity. What does that mean?
So it's their understanding of what a will is. So a lot of people don't really know when a will takes effect, and they get confused with things like LPA or gifting, etc. So it's just understanding sort of what you're doing, essentially, what a will is, when it would take effect, and the consequences of the decisions you're making. So having that understanding of sort of what you write in the will, this is what's going to happen, essentially. Yeah.
And I don't know you, I find there's two ways that I can assess for that. Either through the hour, the 2 hours, whatever it is that I'm doing the assessment, and they're kind of explaining through that conversation, you know, their understanding of what a will is. But then I sometimes you have to be quite direct and blunt, don't you?
Yes.
And sort of say to them, okay, it's lovely you're making these decisions, but when can the person get the money?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time, I've heard people, I'm sure you have, it's always the sweet little old Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith, if for anyone that's followed our other videos, we've assessed her for everything. Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Oh, she's got a lot, but sweet little Mrs. Smith, she's going to leave £50,000 to her son and £50,000 to her daughter, and then you say, well, you know, when can they have this money? And she's sweet, she's in her 80s, and she said, oh, they can have it whenever they want.
Yeah.
And you know that she understands what a will is.
Yeah.
She's just being really kind.
Nice. Yeah.
and nice.
Till you get there.
And in her head, she's going, well, I've got my house. I haven't got any carers. I've got £200,000 in the bank. If they want the 50 grand now, they can have it now. It's not going to affect me. It could affect her.
Absolutely.
But some people are just very sweet, and they want their kids to have the money there and then, or assume that they can. So you have to be blunt, don't you?
Yes, sometimes, and directly ask, which can be quite emotional, because not a lot of people like to think about when they're going to pass away or what will happen, because it's an emotive topic, isn't it? So. And
I realise now that we're sat here smiling and joking, and because of I suppose as social workers, as assessors, we have to build up some resilience to it. But it is an emotional subject that we're talking to people about, isn't it? We don't sit there in the assessments. Well, some people actually have sat and smiled and joked with them about it because they're smiling and joking about it.
Yeah, depends on the person, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Some people cope with things in that way, don't they? That they have to have a laugh about things.
Yeah, and I think as an assessor, how are you managing when those people that are? It's an upsetting subject, because I always kind of thought that when people get into their 80s and 90s, their late 90s possibly, they're kind of prepared for what's next in their journey. But actually, I've spoken to some people, and they're not prepared at all. They don't want to pass away. They don't want to die. They're scared of dying still. And I don't know why. I assumed that you get to that age and you're prepared. So how do you deal with that emotion, I suppose?
Well, we always take quite a therapeutic approach, don't we? So I think it's different for each person, really, and you just sort of have to understand the person that you're working with and just see what they want to talk about, essentially. So maybe they don't want to talk about it, maybe they just want to say it takes effect when I pass away, and then we leave it at that. As long as they understand that, we don't have to go into any more detail, really, do we, if it's a really upsetting topic for them. But if they want to talk about it, I've got all the time in the world to sit there and listen. And
I think that's the key, isn't it? It's not to, if somebody's becoming upset, it's not to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, because I need this piece of evidence, I need you to say this. There's other ways through talking about the will later through down the road that you can get the information. I am just apologies. I didn't think at the beginning of this. I should have said it. If you do have any questions that you want to throw at me or Ashleigh, please do raise your hand or put them in the chat box, and Fumi will write me a note that I won't be able to read, and then she'll shout at me. So please do. If you haven't got any questions, please throw them through. Hello?
Oh.
We heard you.
I'm Rosemary Moore.
Hi, Rosemary. I'm so glad you're on.
To join you just on a phone. I've gone into the people who are organising this for you, and they've just referred me to a phone number and then a PIN number, which I've done, but I can't do it on my computer.
Okay. I
I
will.
would like to say something, but I won't be able to raise my hand or do anything other than to just speak. So
Okay.
is that all right when the time comes?
Absolutely, 100%. I always like speaking to you, Rosemary. I think Fumi's going to send you some links through as well, so we'll try to see if we can get
so
you.
So I could get into the video.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
No worries.
That would be great. Thank you.
No
very
worries
much.
at all. So, what is a will and its effects? I was thinking about this the other day. I went to assess a young man once who had learning disabilities, learning difficulties, and he was quite clear he wanted to leave his entire estate, everything, and he understood his estate. He knew that he had some money in the bank and everything in his room is sheltered housing, shared housing, and he wanted to leave it to David Bowie. Which it's kind of fine. It's a little odd, but people are allowed to make unwise decisions, and I know that's the MCA, but even so, you're still allowed to make an unwise decision, or what other people may think is an unwise decision. And the only thing that really showed that he didn't have capacity, I mean, there was other things, but the biggest thing was when it came to the effects of the will, when the will came into effect. He wanted David to have it now, here and then.
Yes.
Before that, I kind of tried to explain that David Bowie had already passed away, and he became a little bit upset. So we kind of dropped that conversation and moved on to something else. And for a 21-year-old to be infatuated with David Bowie, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that anyway. That's amazing. But it just showed you that he was able. His estate was so limited, so small, that of course he could understand it. It's everything in my room. I don't have anything else. Who do I want to leave it to? Well, my favourite person in the whole wide world, David Bowie.
Yeah. It's quite lovely, really.
I'm not sure if David would have wanted his underwear drawer and everything
not.
else that was in there. So on that. The second leg, as you called it, which is a good word, is they need to understand the extent of their estate.
Yes.
But I'll be honest, if you ask me how much I've got in the bank today, I don't know.
Yes. So
No
it's
idea.
not an exact figure, it's just an estimate of their estate. So how much they would expect the property to be worth, how much they expect they have in savings or investments and things like that. I don't need down to the penny. It's just...
But I suppose you have to be careful with that, don't you? Because it's all right saying I own my own house and I've got a bungalow that my mum left me in Manchester. But if I think that bungalow, I bought my house 20 years ago for £19,000 because it's an ex-council house and all of that. And now it's worth £400,000 because that's how things work. It's not just the ownership of the property that they need to understand, is it?
No.
If I'm sat there going, did you not? You had a case study with
Yes,
this, didn't you?
yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yes. So the case study that I'm going to talk about really emphasises the importance of having this estimate. So it's not about just knowing you've got a property or knowing you've got savings. You need to understand the extent of that to be able to understand what you're doing, essentially. So I had a lady that I went to that had 2 sons. No other family, just her 2 sons, and she wanted to make sure that one of them received the house and one of them received her finances, because she believed then it would be 50-50 split. And that's how she would make sure she was going to show no favouritism, because they would both receive one of her assets each.
Yeah.
So no matter how I sort of phrased it, because her house was worth £500,000 and in the bank she had about 20 grand.
Okay.
So I wrote it on boards and all sorts. I broke it down so that she could see. I wrote the names, how much they'd be getting if she had it like this, etc. She was looking at it and nodding and going, yes, that makes sense. Then I'd take the board away. I'd say, so who's getting more then of your estate? And she'd say, nothing. I want both my boys to have equal. One's getting the house, one's getting the money. And she just couldn't comprehend that house was worth so much more than what she had in the bank.
But if she had bought that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it might have been a £20,000 house. And if she's corresponding the two, or she's just focusing on, it's a direct split. They get one asset, they get one asset.
And the will already stated, she was making amendments, it already said it was 50-50 between the boys. The change she was making she didn't really want to make it. Would have been an unintended consequence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but then, and the other side of that is, because I've seen this where people leave set cash amounts.
Yeah.
Which I know some will writers and some solicitors and some people want to do. The problem becomes, and it's like your client, she goes into care, £20,000 is spent on care, one son gets a house, the other son gets absolutely nothing because the 20 grand's gone. You know, if she's been that specific to say, I'm leaving the money that is in my Lloyd's TSB bank to him and he gets the entire house. That's it. One son gets nothing. Somebody else walks off with £450,000 house.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she didn't understand the extent of her estate. So, I mean, the ones that frustrate me is when you ask that question. You can ask again. It's something you can be quite blunt with. You know, what do you own? What have you got? And the amount of people that go, well, I own this house. I've got £20,000 in the bank. I've got some shares in BP, and that's it. Yeah, that's it. And you're like, oh, okay, and who's getting this, and who's getting that, and who's getting this? And you go through the whole assessment, and then right at the end they say, we just got to figure out what we're going to do with the 2 shops and the villa in France.
Yes.
Oh, well, I didn't know they came under this. Yeah, why would you not?
Or on the flip side of that, you get the people that don't want to tell you about the extent of their estate and they don't think it's relevant to the assessment. So I think that case does highlight how important it is so that you understand what you're doing. You can't understand it without knowing the extent of your estate.
Bizarrely, we had a client years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago maybe, just when we'd first started, solicitor referral. I spoke to the client. The solicitor was fine, had explained everything to him, why it needed to be done. He was leaving a disproportionate amount to one child over another. Spoke to the client, explained what the assessment would entail, explained banks versus Goodfellow, and he said, I am not discussing anything with my estate with you. I do not want to discuss the content of my will with you. I just want you to assess my capacity. So I explained it all over again and explained the law, and he was like, no, I'm not discussing any of that with you. And I was like, okay, we can't do the assessment then. If you can't evidence that you understand the extent of your estate, if you can't evidence the claims that you're going to make, all I can say is, you look nice. Love your jumper. That's it. You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? And testamentary, I find, is one of the nicest and weirdest things that you can do, because you can walk in sometimes and you're, like you said, you've got your whiteboards and you've got your yes, no buttons, all of those sorts of communication aids, and you walk in and somebody will say, for goodness sakes, I don't know why you're here. All I want to do is write on a piece of paper who I'm leaving my house, my 2 cars and my £50,000 in the bank to. I want it to go between my 2 sons. I've got no other children and they're only having it when I die. And you're sat there going, scribbling notes down. And after 4 minutes of being in the room, you sat there kind of going, right, what should we...
lovely pictures
what should we
around
do now? Obviously, we kind of do more than that. We do mockers and FDTs and things like that to make sure that there's... And to continue that conversation. Yeah. Because that's one of the things, isn't it? Somebody can repeat that information and then 10 minutes later, all of a sudden not be able to...
Absolutely.
Make those decisions.
Yeah, I've been out to people before. I remember going out with a solicitor once, and she brought with her 5 draft wills because she wasn't sure which one we were going to sign, because the lady she was so coherent when discussing it, and then 5 minutes later she'd just talk about a completely different wishes that just didn't coincide.
Just can't quite add. That retention. That recall. That delayed recall is impaired, and it does impact on people's capacity. So they need to understand the extent of the will, and then we get on to sort of the main body, because when we're writing our reports, you can be quite academic and bullet pointed almost sometimes with what people are saying in those first 2 sections. So the main one is the comprehension of the claims that they're making. So who's getting what, who's not getting anything, and why. I mean, when we're assessing for that, it's more than just sort of sitting there and saying, getting a list, isn't it?
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
Who's getting what.
Yeah, I do sometimes like to do in these situations, particularly if you've got a really complex family, like a family tree sort of thing, so we can see who's in the family, because I find that, particularly when I go out to people who've got dementia, they can get names confused, which makes it confusing as an assessor to know who's who. if they're just saying different names.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I find, I don't know about you, that if somebody's being excluded from the will, then they won't even talk about them sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, I'm leaving everything to my son. Have you got any other children? I've got another son that I'm leaving some money to. And they don't mention the daughter that's been completely excluded. Especially when you go further down that family tree and you start, I'm leaving some money, a gift to my grandchild, I'm leaving £5,000. Have you got any other grandchildren? Oh yeah, I've got 7 others.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, why are they not getting anything?
Or when people are estranged from the children, sometimes they'll talk about the children that they're in contact with, and just completely neglect to mention that they've got another child, even if they're estranged from them, still their child. So.
Absolutely, and that goes to that moral obligation, doesn't it? That they have, that those people can potentially contest their will if they're not included in some way, shape or form. And it's not that they can still contest it, but if the person has got sufficient capacity and that's evidence, and they've got reason behind their argument of why that person's being excluded. Yeah. I can remember I had a client who didn't want to include her daughter. The daughter, it was one of those awful stories, I suppose. Had been bullying as a child and mental health issues through secondary school. That led to drug addiction and alcohol abuse in later life, and then domestic violence and all sorts of things. And mum had ended up with drug dealers ringing the house phone, even though the daughter didn't live there, and threatening her, and the relationship had completely fallen apart. And the reason that the mum didn't want to leave her any money wasn't out of anger or anything like that. She knew that if she left her £100,000, her daughter would die.
Of course, yeah.
Because that £100,000 would be spent on drugs or alcohol, or she was so vulnerable other people had come along and abused her to get that money. So she didn't see it as a gift. She saw it as a negative for her daughter, so she wanted to exclude her from it. But getting that within the report is really good evidence.
Yeah.
And language is really important, isn't it?
Oh, got a bit of feedback.
A little bit of reverb there. Language and the way people speak is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm quite, when we have new starters speak, new starters with Nellie Swartz, I'm quite adamant that if somebody swears, that should be included in the report.
Yeah.
And I am going to swear now, so if anybody's easily offended, please cover your ears or mute me. But there's a difference between saying, I don't want my son included, he's a right little toe rag, and saying, I don't want my son included, he's a fucking bastard. He's done this and I fucking hate him.
Yeah.
And that language is so important. Yeah, it's an expression of their emotion and their anger and their upset. And for us as assessors to manipulate that by putting in less offensive words, it's not right. And any judge needs to see that frustration, that anger, that emotion written down on paper. So we have to look at who they're leaving it to as primary beneficiaries. But there's a sort of a little bit of a sad area on when we're talking about beneficiaries as well.
Yes, absolutely. When you have to give consideration to what's going to happen if one of your beneficiaries were to pass away prior to yourself, which oftentimes we're speaking about the death of people's children and the loved ones.
And grandchildren sometimes.
Yeah. So
which is I find that...
Again, really emotive,
when you're talking about, they're leaving a gift to their 12-year-old grandchild, and you have to say, well, what happens if the worst happens? Is that people coming in or asking questions? Fabulous. How do you deal with that? Because I mean that the emotion of considering your own passing away. Yeah. And then on that such a deeper level of considering what happens if your grandchild passes.
When talking about things like that, I do always try and sort of soften the blow and say, I know this is quite unlikely to happen and it's difficult to think about, but if this was to happen, what would your wishes be? Yeah. And then most people are quite okay talking about it because they know in their head that it's unlikely, especially if they're quite old, that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And reassuring, no, it's all right. You'll die first. Don't worry about it.
Not quite like that,
but maybe I'm being too blunt. But they again, that shows that that comprehension to the claims that they're making, doesn't
Yeah,
it? They're
absolutely.
understanding that actually, if one of my beneficiaries passes away, what happens to that money?
Yeah.
You know, does it go back into the estate? Does it go to you know, if it's a son, does it go to the son's wife? Does it go to the children, the grandchildren? If it does it go equally, or does it
and
go
it's
to
so
one more
important as
than
well, because
another?
you don't know what's going to happen, do you? So although we say it's unlikely, you don't know. It's our job to make sure that person's wishes are fulfilled.
Yeah.
So we need to know what their wishes would be if the worst did happen.
Yeah.
So it's just so
And
important.
It's weird because we're not, and I get this sometimes, and I get their confusion with it, because I've had it a couple of times where they're like, "Oh, have you written my will?"
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
that's a legal document. It has to be done in a different style,
Yeah.
actually, and we do have to be careful that we're not writing their will.
Yeah.
But on top of that, we need probably as much information in those reports as the will contains.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we've talked about the first part, and then the extent of the estate and the comprehension of the claims that ought to be made.
Last one's a difficult one.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's perversion. Does a person have an illness that perverts their sense of right or prevents them from making their will? Which
Yeah.
sounds really complex. And
Yeah.
have you got a case study? I can't remember.
You had a case
I
study
had a
for
case
this
study.
one, yeah.
I know I have. I couldn't remember whether
No.
you do. I do, because it's not the perfect case study for testamentary capacity, but it's perfect for that
Yeah,
little
that's
bit.
specific. Yeah.
So I went to see a young lady who had schizophrenia, and she managed it fairly well. You know, on a day-to-day basis, she was fit and healthy. It wasn't causing too many issues, and she heard and saw a man that was her voice, and he spoke to her, and he did say nasty things to her, and tried to get her to do nasty things. One of the things was about killing the dog, the pet dog, and some of it was so extreme that she'd learnt to ignore him, and to ignore this voice. But there was one thing that he kept saying that she couldn't disprove, and she couldn't sort of get over, and that was the fact that he'd told her that her brother had been replaced by a robot.
Yeah.
So when it came to writing her will, she was genuinely a little bit, I don't want to leave anything to him, because I don't think that's it. I'm not sure. I can't prove that my voice isn't being honest, and that actually he has been replaced by a robot. Apart from cutting him open and having a look inside, so how do I prove that he's not been replaced by a robot? So she didn't want to leave him. She didn't want to include him in the will. Which part of it is logical, but it's not logical because that is literally her illness, was perverting her sense of right and wrong. So at that point, we weren't able to say that she did have capacity, and we had to say that she didn't have capacity. Thankfully, I think it was 6 months, a year later, something like that, she'd managed to get more support about managing her voice. I don't think it was around medication, it was about managing her voice, and she'd been, amazingly, she'd started to be able to turn the voice to a positive voice rather than a negative voice. Which I heard somebody from Hearing Voices explain this once. Having schizophrenia is literally having a negative voice screaming at you all the time. And if you imagine how horrific that is, having a negative voice telling you negative things all the time. You can't even imagine it, can you? But imagine having a positive voice telling you how brilliant you are all the time and how amazing you are all the time. And she'd managed to sort of work on this, and she'd managed to identify that her brother, this was an untruth, and it wasn't perverting her anymore. So she was able to write a will later on. And we see it with dementia sometimes as well, don't we?
Yeah.
People all sort of say, I had one recently, didn't want to leave anything to the daughter because she kidnaps and murders babies. And there was no truth
it
behind
is difficult,
it.
because sometimes these disorders of the mind or brain can cause so much confusion for people that, and sometimes they're acting straight away as well. So I went out to a lady not long ago that she'd had a little bit of a falling out with her son about what they're going to do on Christmas Day, and had decided that she's cutting him out of the will now because of that. But so much can change in that time. But yeah, it's just so unusual, isn't it, how the impairment of the mind or brain can impact your decision making.
Yeah, and that instant, you know, well, he was supposed to come and pick me up to take me to the shops, and he didn't, so that's it. You know, I'm cutting him out completely.
Yeah.
And you have to be careful as an assessor. Is this the illness that's perverting them?
Yeah.
Or is this actually, there's more going on behind this story? This is a trigger event, but actually there's a lot more behind this story, and you know, the relationship's been damaged for 20 years, and that's why she didn't win. This is just a thing that's triggered that reaction.
In that box as well, it also mentions, doesn't it, about does the disorder of the mind sort of prevent them from accurately disposing of the property by will? So for that, I always look out for whether they're coherent throughout as well, as whether the wishes are the same all the way through, because as I said, people can change their mind so frequently that it's quite difficult to keep up with what they want.
That consistency is important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And most of the time, the lack of consistency is a result of an impairment of the mind or brain, because it's caused them so much confusion.
Well, there is, and I think sometimes there's undue influence as well, isn't there?
Yes.
Because I've seen that where somebody's been chopping and changing their mind of who's getting what all the way through, and you can almost see it. They're remembering that, oh no, I'm supposed to say this, I'm supposed to say that, I'm supposed to say that my daughter's getting everything, and all of a sudden it changes. So you have to sort of go back and say, look, forget what everyone else is saying to you.
Yeah.
What do you want? Nobody else will see this report. You and your solicitor. That's it.
It's surprising
you have to reassure people
that you have to reassure people that this is your decision. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. If you don't want anyone to know until after you've died, they don't have to. This is your will. Yeah. You need to make sure it reflects your wishes. And
that's one of the, I love testamentary, and I know most of our assessors adore doing testamentary, because it's that you're protecting that person's last ever decision. You know, this is the last decision that they will make, and you're protecting that. And I think that's a wonderful thing for a social worker to do, or an assessor to do. You'll have to forgive me for my changing languages. We've recently had some psychology graduates join the team, so we've gone from just social workers to an MDT, which is great for us. Yeah. But I keep calling everyone social workers, and they're not. They're assessors. So we just wanted to talk as well about why this is important, why getting a testamentary capacity assessment is important. Because obviously, if there's concerns about somebody lacking capacity, then the golden rule kicks in. You know, is the person over 70? Is there an illness? Is there a concern about their capacity? Then you should realistically get a capacity assessment. But there's other reasons as well, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. As we've already talked about, so it's respecting people's autonomy. We're going out and making sure people aren't under undue influence, which we're safeguarding people's rights, aren't we, essentially? Yeah. We could be the first people to go in and spot this, which could lead to safeguarding referrals and things if they are under undue influence. Also, it's important to prevent future legal disputes. So it's always a good one, isn't it? When people ask me when I go in and they say, why do I need this? That's typically what I say. I'll say it's to prevent in the future, if anyone can test your will, it'll help prove that these were your wishes and this is what you want.
You're absolutely, I mean, it's about protecting their autonomy, it's about protecting their decision making. And it is those clients that we see where there is no concerns about their capacity, there's no mental health illnesses or anything like that could be an impairment of the mind or brain that could be perverting or preventing their sense of right, but they're leaving their son out of the will. And it's just to sort of stop that argument later down the road, that the son can straight away turn around and say, well, actually, you know, I don't think that she had capacity to make this will. And it stops that potential future litigation. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we do Montreal cognitive assessments as part of our assessments, is even if the person has got dementia, we can say, well, actually, then, we you know, one of the reasons is we can identify what their cognition was like on the day, but we've also had it where we've gone out and assessed somebody years ago before we were mocker assessors, and then 3 months later we've been told, well, actually they had a diagnosis of dementia, which kind of it doesn't mean that they lack capacity, but it throws a spanner into the works, because we were unaware of that
Absolutely,
diagnosis. Whereas the mocker, we can then turn around and say, well, actually, we didn't know about the diagnosis, but we knew there was something. We did this cognitive assessment. There was there was evidence of a mild
it's
cognitive
beneficial
impairment.
just for that, really, isn't it?
And testamentary is the same. It's about stopping that argument later down the road. So why is it important? Because if you've got concerns about capacity, then you should get a capacity assessment done. But actually, if there is no concerns, but there is concerns, it could be contested later down the road. One of the questions that we've recently been asked and keep discussing with people is what happens if somebody doesn't consent to the assessment taking place. If I'm a will writer, I'm a solicitor, and I think I've got concerns about this person's capacity, and I say you need to get a capacity assessment done before we write the will, what do they do? If the person turns around and says, well, I don't want to pay for that, I don't want a capacity assessment done, you walk away. This is about protecting your professional integrity as well. It's difficult to walk away, especially if you're a small business owner, to walk away from a paying customer that you've worked hard to get as well. But the potential issues it causes for you and your integrity and your name and everything later down the road to find out that you should not have written that will is huge. We wanted to talk about the importance of the compliance of the reports. Obviously, if you do a testamentary assessment and it's under the Mental Capacity Act 2005, chances are it's going to be thrown out of court. But there's also CPR 35 compliance, and I know you kind of went because you kind of don't get involved in that side of things.
No, not particularly.
But so there's a thing called Civil Procedure Rules 35. Which basically says how a expert witness's report is supposed to be laid out. So when we're writing our reports, they have to be in line with CPR 35 or FPR 25, which is Family Procedure Rules, which basically says that you have to evidence where you've got the information from, your qualifications, and you have to make a declaration to the court that what you're saying is honest and true. What we do see sometimes is letters from GPs, that's not fair. Not even from GPs, from GP surgeries, signed off by a stamp with just a letterhead that says Mrs. Smith has got capacity to write a will. It's not going to be strong enough, is it?
No, absolutely not.
Because all the things that we're talking about are missing. I kind of feel bad for Ashleigh because we're going to put her on spot with compliance because it's not. Well, it's built into our templates.
It is. That's right. I don't really know the legal jargon around it, but I just do it naturally now. I don't know because I've been doing it so long. We just fill out the reports and they're always compliant, whether I know it or not.
But it is important for you guys if you're using somebody else to do your assessments. I have no issue with that. There's plenty of other assessors that aren't as good as us. But make sure they are. If those reports aren't in line with the civil procedure rules, potentially they could fail. That said, I know there has been cases where people have had capacity assessments done and they've just not been very good. But the judge has relied on the solicitor's case notes, which have been so good and so comprehensive. That's evidence that the person had capacity to write the will anyway. So it's important that if you're instructing somebody to do a testamentary assessment or any capacity assessment, it's what you're paying for. Realistically, if you're paying for a service, make sure it's the right thing. You're getting what you should be out of it. I've got a light in my eyes, Fumi. That's why I'm sort of having to do that. I just wanted to touch back on undue influence a little bit, because in testamentary capacity, undue influence is probably one of the biggest concerns, but also it's one of those things that comes out more in testamentary capacity. Probably the next one's lasting powers of attorney, I'd guess. Other than that, this is the main one sort of thing. Do you want to just explain how we kind of identify whether there is undue influence, something in financial decision trackers and stuff like that?
So I always make sure to sort of mitigate that risk of undue influence. I always make sure that... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm being
We're
past
being
the question.
interrupted.
No, carry on.
I always make sure that there's nobody in the room that would benefit from the will. So I like to make sure the person's on their own and they can express themselves freely. And I always ask if it's their decision as well. So I'd say, why have you decided to do this now? And if they say, because my son who's sitting listening in the next room has told me I've got to or he's moving out, then it's easy enough to detect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not always that simple and you have to do a bit of digging, but it comes out through the assessment when someone's on their own and you're talking, you make them feel comfortable. If they feel comfortable enough with you to tell you that they're under pressure, they will. Or you can sort of see the signs, can't you?
It's breaking down those barriers
yeah,
again,
absolutely,
isn't it? Yeah. I think we had one of our social workers do this. They went through the entire will with the daughter in the room. No concerns about this client's capacity, but there was concerns about undue influence. And they got right to the end, and she said, do you mind if I see Mum alone? The daughter's like, no. And I think you can do that in two ways. You can either do it and upset the other person, or you can do it and kind of say, look, I'm doing this to protect you.
Tactful, yeah. I always say that because we write the names down in the report, don't we? I say, I have to write your name down so it won't look very good if you're benefiting from it and your name's saying, you wouldn't leave the room.
Yeah,
so.
essentially, yeah. But this client turned around and said, do you mind, should we go for a walk? Have you seen the trees in my garden? It's beautiful. And they walked right down to the bottom of this lady's garden, and they got down to the bottom and she said, everything I've just told you is a load of rubbish. And she said, that's not what I want to do at all. This is what I want to do. And there was no concerns about her capacity, but she was under a lot of pressure to make certain decisions, but was so strong enough, and our social worker had given her the opportunity.
Yeah, that's why it's so important for them to be seen on their own, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just to mitigate that risk.
Yeah. I think video link, when we look at undue influence, is really difficult, and we've always offered video link since COVID times. But I've always it should have always been the last option.
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
during the first lockdown, we were still doing face-to-face visits because it was important. I know other people didn't want to do that, and that's fine. We were fortunate. We had Kerry doing our risk assessments and everything for us, but we did. And some of the ridiculous ideas of how to mitigate undue influence on video link just made me giggle. The main one that I kept hearing was ask people to pan the camera around the room to see if there's anyone else in the room. Because if you're an abuser, you can't step out of a room for 10 seconds or walk around as the camera pans around, or duck. Apparently abusers don't know how to duck. It's ridiculous. I think, and we always say with video link especially, it's actually easier sometimes to spot that undue influence, because people will do what I've just done, where they'll go, because they're reading something off a piece of paper, it's already written for them, or they'll look off camera because they want to look somewhere else, or there'll be pauses in between what you're saying and what they're asking, because they're waiting for somebody else to tell them what to say. The biggest way I find to get around it is, say, if there's somebody else in the room, they're allowed to be there. They can come on camera, and they'll do one or two things. They'll either look off camera at the person naturally, and then they'll go, oh no, there's nobody else here. You're lying. Who have you just looked at? Or the other person will feel comfortable enough to come onto camera, because you've put them in that position where
they're on the spot.
They have to. So I think video sometimes can be easier to spot. The other thing, and I know this wasn't in our brief before we did this, I wanted to talk about it was undue influence. I wanted to just explain to people about the financial decision tracker that we do as well. Not really to sell our services or anything like that, but because so the financial decision tracker is something set up by Wayne State University in the US. So during COVID, there was a kind of a little bit of a push on LinkedIn and social media around financial vulnerability assessments and things like that. And I don't think financial vulnerability assessments never really got picked up by the legal sector too much, and I think that's simply down to there's not a legal requirement. But we always apply them in a lot of our assessments. So Wayne State University developed this system years ago with Dr. Peter Lichtenberg, who, do you know what, we should get on on the sofa. That'd be amazing. I know Peter is lovely.
Oh.
And so he's developed these multiple choice questions.
Yes.
And the idea is that I ask you, the financial decision tracker is 10 questions. It has to be over a financial decision. One of them is writing your will. And you ask 10 questions, give them multiple choice options to those 10 questions. But then you have to mark what your answer as the assessor is as well. So one of the questions is, what decision are you making today? And then it's, are you making a gift?
Yeah.
Are you estate planning? Are you writing a will? Are you allowing somebody else to access your finances? Things like that.
Yeah.
And the amount of people that I've gone through, and I've kind of been borderline for testamentary capacity, and then I ask these questions, and because it's asking direct questions maybe in slightly different way, slightly different language, all of a sudden you're almost having to go back to the beginning of your original assessment and start again. Because, what decision are we making today? Oh, I'm letting somebody else access my bank.
Yeah.
Are you?
Sounds
okay. So, we spent an hour talking about your will,
Yeah.
and now you're talking about accessing your bank. Where's this come from, sort of thing? For you guys, especially those that don't assess capacity, the FDT, so you can go to olderadultnestegg.com and register for their training. The training's like 5 minutes, and all of you can do the training and do the financial decision trackers. And I think it gives you a really good insight into whether actually somebody is it their decision that they're making,
Absolutely,
or has somebody else influenced it, and if they have influenced it, what influence they've had. If you ask somebody, was this your decision to write your will? If you ask me that, well, no, it was Kerry's. My wife. She instigated it. She said, well, actually, we need to get our wills written. And me and her have had conversations of what's going to be in our wills. So there is some influence. It's not undue.
No.
So it takes that into account, and you can have those discussions about actually, where has this decision to write the will come from? Why now? Why has this happened? Please do have a look on Older Adult Nest Egg. We had a question come through. I'm just going to try and bring it back up on this phone because it's a clarification really. Okay. So Annie Butler asked, I understand walking away where someone doesn't wish to have an assessment and we have concerns around their capacity, but are you saying that we should walk away where someone is cutting a person out of their will and we have no concerns about their capacity? No.
Yeah.
No. If they don't meet that golden rule, if you have no concerns about their capacity and you've documented that in your case notes, then absolutely no. I mean, if I was cutting somebody out of my will, I'm 44 years old. I know. I'm 44 years old. I'm married with 2 children. If I was cutting one of my children out of the will, why would you assess my capacity? I've got no mental health conditions. I've got no history of mental health conditions. There's no cause for concern that I lack capacity. That said, if I turned around to my solicitor and said, but I want a capacity assessment doing, so that cannot be used against me in the future, then there's no reason why that assessment can't be taking place. But no, you don't need to walk away if somebody is making an unbalanced will or something like that and there are no concerns about their capacity. They don't hit the golden rule. This is about protecting you, and I think this is one of the things, isn't it? Sometimes our assessments can't protect the individual, but they do protect the professional. I can remember a case where I went out to see a lady. It was bizarre. We found out later on, way after the assessment, that a niece was her lasting power of attorney for finances. But we were contacted by a nephew who was from Israel to do a capacity assessment on his aunt, who was in her 80s, 90s. And we would be met there by his friend who was from France at the flat. So we turned up, and already there was kind of, it's all a little odd, but families are odd. And this lady, there was no concerns about her capacity, but this French woman sat through the entire assessment telling me that regardless of what she said, the flat and all of her estate should be left to the nephew, and that's what she wants. And she talked over her, and she told her what she wanted. I mean, the undue influence was so obvious, it was ridiculous. So I wrote my assessment, contacted the solicitor and said, look, I've got no doubts about her capacity, but dear God, this is not what she wants. The undue influence was massive, and that's in my report. I said to the solicitor, look, realistically, you shouldn't write this will. And we had a good conversation about it, and he said, no, we're not writing the will. It's as simple as that. The problem was that I can almost guarantee that lady was marched down to another solicitor, another will writer, bought a will offline, something, and that will was written anyway.
But again, even doing that though, us going out, you could then refer that to adult safeguarding and the concern.
Absolutely, and that was all done.
Yeah, we're still safeguarding people, aren't we?
We
In a way,
protected the solicitor rather than the person. So I hope that answers your question, Annie. Okay. So we're going to finish up there. So we're not here next month because we've got NellieCon, our face-to-face conference over in Peterborough. So if you haven't got tickets, please do go on to nelliesupports.com. Top right-hand corner, there's a little NellieCon. Go onto there and you'll go through to Eventbrite, buy tickets. We're back in December with Louise Thornton, our senior social worker, our senior practitioner, who will be discussing gifts because it's Christmas time, and why else would you not discuss gifts?
We have a bit of an issue for people joining to send out to everyone.
We've had some issues with people joining, so the video of this, the recording of this, will be sent out to everybody. If you search Nellie Supports on YouTube, we pop up as well, and all of the previous videos and this one will also be on YouTube. Please do come along to NellieCon. We are going to be having Nellie on the sofa at NellieCon, so the morning speakers will be talking in a session for Nellie on the sofa, and then the afternoon session as well. And they will be recorded and sent out to everyone as well. Fumi, do you want to come on and tell everyone? Cause we have questions. Oh, sorry. Oh, I tell you, this producer is absolutely awful. It's like working with Carl Pilkington, I tell you. Honestly. The only difference is Fumi's got hair. If you have any questions, please do email us at nellie@nelliesupports.com, and as always we will try to answer them. And if we don't see you at NellieCon, please do look out for your emails, and we will see you in December for Nellie on the Sofa in December.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.